Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. I have on today three special guests. We've had Christopher and Tyler before, but this will be the first time that we have Erick Ybarra. Is that how you pronounce your last name?
Yes.
Ybarra. Okay. So a lot of people told me, Suan, you've assembled the dream team once again to talk about the papacy, and I'm really excited. So I'm just going to have everyone quickly introduce yourselves. So let's start with Erick, and then we'll go down to Tyler, and then we'll close with Christopher. So Erick, you introduce yourself first.
Yes. Thank you for having me on again. So I was raised Roman Catholic, became an atheist in high school. When I reached university, had a conversion experience into Protestantism for years, and then came down the Canterbury Trail towards Anglicanism and reached the fork where Constantinople and Rome were envisioned. I chose Rome, became Catholic, and since then I've just been very passionate about the study of history, particularly the Orthodox schism and the Anglican Reformation, and so those are where my interests lie. I'm really glad to be joined with you gentlemen, and look forward to what we can dig out here.
All right, Tyler.
Yeah, so I grew up in a somewhat of a nominal Southern Baptist home, and was an agnostic, and became Christian, and very quickly in the Reformed Christian community. Long story short, I'm in full communion with Rome, and I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at the university at St. Joseph University in Macau. And so primarily do epistemology stuff, but I like to dabble in stuff related to theology as well.
All right, and Christopher.
Yeah, so I was born into a Catholic family and baptized as an infant and went to Catholic school, but did not become serious about my practice of the faith until I was about 15 years old. I spent 2 years studying as a seminarian for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia after I graduated from high school. After that, I left and I pursued philosophy. I'm now a PhD student at Baylor, which is Baptist, but has a lot of great Catholics in the Department of Philosophy. And yeah, that's me.
All right, I guess I'll introduce myself real quick for Erick, since this is the first time, I think he's encountered some of us. So I originally was raised in a very good Baptist home. I had exceptional parents, and they're still great, and they still love me, even though I've converted and crossed the Tiber to Rome. Yeah, basically in high school, I had a big kind of conversion experience, if you will, where I went from like radical liberal to conservative, and thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas and other Catholic philosophers really helped in that movement. And then when I was in college, we were studying secularism, how the Reformation contributed to it. One of my friends invited me to Mass, and then from there I started asking questions, and then it was game over, to give you the short version of the story. By the way, Tyler, I received my Word on Fire Bible after I subscribed to your newsletter, so I just want to thank you and your co-host for that. Furthering Christendom is Tyler's channel. Great stuff. All right, so to give you the rundown for how we're going to do the episode today, we're going to start off with Christopher Tomaszewski introducing us to the papacy and responding to a particular, or actually two objections that are in the literature at the moment. And then we're going to have yours truly talk about the scriptural case for the papacy. We'll go to Tyler to talk about papal improbabilities. And what was the other thing I was going to have you talk about? It was, an epistemology.
Authority.
Yeah, authority. Yeah. And then finally, we're going to have Erick Ybarra talk about the Eastern Orthodox challenge to the papacy and Catholicism. So we're going to try to keep it really strict on time, 15 minutes for presentation, 15 minutes for conversation, and we'll switch from each speaker. So Christopher, I will now set up my timer to give you 15 minutes. If you go over, it's okay. Just know it's going to come off of the total 30 minutes for your portion. All right, when you start talking, I'll start the timer.
Okay. So let me just spend a really quick moment saying what the doctrine of the papacy is for Catholics at a very elementary level. First of all, it proceeds from what I think is actually a logically more fundamental doctrine, namely that the church has a hierarchical structure, that there are elders or bishops or whatever you want to call them in the church. It adds something to that, namely that one of these elders, one of these bishops, has primacy of jurisdiction over the rest of the church in all of its fullness. Now, of course, I think what comes to mind actually doctrinally, especially in the minds of many Protestants, when we talk about the papacy, more so than primacy of jurisdiction, is doctrinal infallibility. But that's historically a later development. Originally, issues around the papacy, as I'm sure Erick will explain for us later on, center around questions of jurisdiction or church governance. And so what the Catholic Church believes, right, is that St. Peter was bestowed an immediate fullness of jurisdiction over the entire church by Christ, that he has perpetual successors in the bishops of Rome. And that's all de fide. Okay, so what I want to talk about are two objections that one might have and that have been recently championed by Dr. Jerry Walls against the papacy. One that we might call the bad pope's objection, and another that we might call the development of papal doctrine objection, or the alleged lack of early popes objection. And I'll talk about the first one first. I'll talk about the second one first. The lack of early popes, alleged lack of early popes. So this objection basically states that, contrary to what the Catholic Church teaches, St. Peter was not, in fact, the first bishop of Rome, and therefore not the Pope. And none of his immediate successors, at least up until about the end of the 2nd century, were popes either. And one reason you might think that this is so is because the historical evidence is at least alleged to have been such that in the first 2 centuries, we don't have any reason to think there was a single monarchical bishop in Rome overseeing all the other clergy in Rome. I don't know whether that's the case, or to what extent that's the case. I am not a church historian. I am a philosopher trained in metaphysics and epistemology. So my goal here is to try to clear some ground for Erick and possibly Tyler in saying what the doctrine of the church actually is and what would therefore count or not count as evidence against it. And that's just what I'm saying there, right? I mean, should be uncontroversial. I'm stating a basic epistemological truth, namely that in order to know what counts as evidence against a theory, you have to know what the theory predicts. And in order to know what the theory predicts, you have to know what the theory is. And so one of the exceptions I took to the way that Dr. Walls presents a lot of the material is that he's not an expert in Catholic theology. And I think he gets a lot of the Catholic theology wrong. Or at least he assumes things that the Catholic theology does not imply or entail, okay? And before I get further into this, I just want to say, mostly by way of autobiographical note, that the papacy is a very obvious thing for me. Because for me, it seems like it's an a priori desideratum on church governance that you have a pope, right? That if you're going to set up a church, you want someone who has the ability to definitively settle questions of doctrine and to settle disputes about church governance in a final and definitive way. And so if your church just doesn't have that kind of structure, it doesn't have that kind of office present within it, it seems to me, at least, right? It just seems to me that that's a serious strike against your church being the church created by established by an all-wise and providential God, because in my view, an all-wise and providential God would not leave his church without the ability to definitively and irreformably settle questions of doctrine or to get definitive answers on matters of church governance. But all the same, I want to try to confront these objections and figure out whether we have good reason to think from Catholic doctrine, whether we have good reason from Catholic doctrine to think that we should expect to see the Pope behaving in a certain way in Rome in the first 2 centuries, or whether we should expect all the popes to be very virtuous men. So let me talk about the question of early popes first. I think the accusation here is simply that contrary to what the Catholic Church teaches, in fact, we don't see any evidence for an episcopal office at all in Rome in the first 2 centuries of church history. It seems instead that Rome is being governed by what could at most be characterized as the presbyteral council by several heads of various house churches that govern the church at Rome collectively. And I think the fundamental error in thinking that this counts as evidence against Catholic claims about the papacy is that the Catholic Church does not teach any doctrines that would predict that St. Peter or his immediate successors in the first 2 centuries of Christian history would be highly visible leaders in Rome. It does tell us that St. Peter could have infallibly settled questions of doctrine, and that he possessed full and universal jurisdiction throughout the whole church. But that does not predict or imply that we would see him exercise that power in any particular way in the first two centuries, or his successors. In fact, I think it actually slightly predicts the opposite, that we should expect St. Peter to be concerned more with the affairs of the universal church, given his role, than with the local governance of the church in Rome. And I think one piece of confirmation that we get for that claim is that we find him exercising his leadership at the Council of Jerusalem, where he's not the bishop. He's not the bishop there. He's not the local bishop. Instead of being in Rome, where he is in fact the bishop. And that continues to this day, right? Francis does not concern himself very much with the day-to-day affairs of governing the church at Rome. He is almost entirely consumed in the affairs of the universal church. There's in fact an office called the Vicar for Rome that is occupied by a bishop who more or less exercises the episcopal function in Rome itself on behalf of Francis. Now, of course, Francis could at any time take that office away and begin to exercise those powers in his own person and so forth. But I'm just trying to illustrate the point that, he doesn't have to. We shouldn't expect him necessarily to. And in fact, insofar as he has other responsibilities, we'd expect him not to. And likewise for other bishops, every bishop in every diocese throughout the Catholic Church has presbyteral councils, like unto what you might consider a collective leadership of house churches that run many of the affairs of the diocese with the approval and oversight of the bishop, but nevertheless that they're the ones doing it. So I think it's just a mistake to infer from the fact that we claim that St. Peter was the first pope and therefore the first bishop of Rome, that we should see him exercising his powers as the Bishop of Rome in a certain way in Rome, such that he would come to the attention of other fathers or bishops of the church who would commentate upon his being the Bishop of Rome, or his exercising his episcopate there in any particular way. By way of further historical example, right? I mean, if an objection like this worked, then it would be the case that we could just as easily say that the Avignon papacies or the Great Western Schism shows that there's no popes in the 14th century, because right in the Avignon papacy, the Pope up and leaves Rome altogether, moves the entire papal court to Avignon, and that's where he's exercising his episcopate from. He's not in Rome at all for 7 papacies. But obviously that doesn't mean that he's not the Bishop of Rome. And likewise, during the Great Western Schism, right, there were heated disputes about who the true Pope was. It wasn't clear whether the Roman bishop or the Avignon bishop or the Pisan bishops were the true popes, at least for a time. We eventually got a resolution to that. But the point here is that, like, uncertainty about who the Pope is because there's competing claims or because he's not actually in Rome or any of that doesn't mean that there's not actually a true Pope, right? This is a claim about who actually is the real Pope, not a prediction about how we would see him exercise his power or even where he might be located. So we shouldn't expect necessarily to see St. Peter or his immediate successors exercising jurisdiction in Rome in a certain particular way. Although there may well be good historical evidence that he did that. Okay. Now, there's an important analogy that I want to get to here between the claim that Dr. Walls makes about the alleged lack of popes in Rome in the first 2 centuries and and Arianism, right? So one reply you might make that I think is a good reply to his objection is that we should not expect to see St. Peter exercising typical papal powers immediately in Rome as the Bishop of Rome, or even necessarily episcopal powers, due to what Catholics usually call the development of doctrine, right? Where yes, the doctrines are all there in the deposit of faith as given to us by Christ, but it takes time for the doctrines to fully develop. And at times, it even takes some time for the doctrines to fully develop, even in the minds of the people who have the power that the doctrines attribute, right? So even St. Peter himself or his immediate successors may not have been fully aware of what the doctrines entail. And so in the video that Dr. Walls did with Cameron Bertuzzi on Capturing Christianity, at around 3110, he says this is a really bad objection. One reason it's a really bad objection is that Vatican I makes it very clear that Peter was the first pope. And he somehow infers from this that we would not have doctrinal development. But this is to mistake the doctrine with our knowledge of the doctrine. It's quite true, as Vatican I claims, that Peter was the first pope, but that does not mean that Peter knew what it meant to be the first pope in all of its various detail. And therefore, it does not mean that we would necessarily see Peter exercising papal power at Rome or any of his immediate successors. It's very clear that even the popes themselves come to a gradual realization of what their office entails throughout history. And when you get to Vatican I, what you're getting is a claim about what the doctrine is and who St. Peter was and what kind of powers he had, not claims about whether he knew he had those powers or whether he exercised those powers in a certain way or any of this. So this would be very analogous, I think, with Arianism, where of course it does belong to the deposit of faith that Christ is God, but there persists intense dispute, not just about the entailments of that, right? How the metaphysics all works out, but the very truth of the question, whether Christ is God, gets debated right up until the Council of Nicaea. And Arianism is taken by many bishops, most bishops, to be a live option, such that the weight of the opinion of most bishops is in favor of Arianism. And this isn't, like, I want to reiterate, this is not, a hard question about the metaphysics of the incarnation. We get those later on with Nestorianism and monothelitism and so on. This is just a basic question: is Christ God? And most bishops said no, right? At one point in church history. And obviously, the divinity of Christ is a far more fundamental issue than the papacy. So to think that you need St. Peter or his immediate successors to fully understand their own office, or for other bishops or fathers of the church to fully understand his office and be reporting on this in early church history before this end of the 2nd century, just does not make sense when you don't even have all the bishops on the same page about the divinity of Christ. Again, the basic question, not its hard entailments, but the basic question, until 325 AD. Okay, so I'll stop there. I wanted to talk about bad popes, but time gets away from you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, if anyone has anything to comment about what Christopher has said so far, we can do that. Or if Christopher wants to continue to bad popes, we could move on to that as well. Eric, it looked like you had some comments, on your mind.
No, I was just absorbing. So.
All right. Tyler, do you have any questions?
Yeah, so I think just curious how you would reply, Christopher. I think Jerry would say something like that the two doctrines reflecting on the deity of Christ or reflecting on the deity of the Spirit is not analogous to papal development, because papal development is about church jurisdiction, and it's about an office in which one knows that they have in some sense, or so I think you'd probably say that they're not analogous. So I was just curious if you could give us some more motivation, perhaps before you get into the bad popes argument, more motivation for thinking that the two are pretty relevantly similar, just because I know that that's probably what he would say.
Right. I mean, so I think what he says in the Capturing Christianity video certainly is something along the lines of, well, he says two things. He says what I claimed he said it at around 3110 from that video about Vatican I. Right? He just says, no, Vatican I claims that Peter was the first pope. And that's right. But that doesn't mean there wasn't doctrinal development, because what Vatican I doesn't claim is that Peter understood all the entailments of being pope, that he understood, for example, that he had the power to appoint and remove other bishops, or that he had the power to overrule a council with respect to doctrinal questions, or whatever the case may be. I mean, and in the same way, the other thing he says is, well, with Arianism, although there was controversy about the divinity of Christ, the basics concerning, Nicene Christology are there from the beginning. But of course, we're going to make the same claim about the papacy as well. And insofar as, I mean, the basics for Nicene Christology were there from the beginning, I mean, they weren't there enough to prevent, as I said before, a majority of the world's bishops from just outright denying the divinity of Christ, right?
Sure.
This is an important point, because I think the way in which Jerry sees this analogy is that there's somehow agreement about the basic divinity of Christ, but there's disagreement about what that entails. And I think that's a misrepresentation of pre-Nicene Christology altogether. There is not basic agreement about the proposition that Christ is God. And it's not just about, well, is he two persons or two natures in one person? Does he have two intellects or just one intellect, two wills or just one will, and so on? Those are hard questions that the church comes to confront later on in church history. But the Arian controversy was about the basic proposition. Is Christ God? Whatever we mean by that, whatever it means to be God. is he that? And the majority of the bishops of the world pre-Nicene Council say no. On the other hand, right, Jerry wants to say, well, with the papacy, everything's got to be very clear from the beginning. It should be clear to St. Peter what kind of office he holds, and I think that's right. I think it is clear to St. Peter what office he holds. I do think St. Peter knew and had to know that, for example, that he was the Prince of the Apostles. Let's put it that way. That if a dispute arose between him and St. James, for example, that his word carried the day and St. James' word did not. I think those are things that he knew and understood, or at least those are things to which we are reasonably committed in virtue of the relevant dogmas.
Christopher, could I interject real quick?
Sure.
Yeah, so just to cite where Jerry Walls is, so in his paper, if Christ be not raised, if Peter be not Pope, or I think I got that a little mixed up, but in that paper he cites from Vatican I, and this is the quote from Vatican I that he's claiming says that everyone knew the papacy right from the start. So this is from Vatican I. It says, "For no one can be in doubt. Indeed, it was known in every age that the holy and most blessed Peter, prince and head of the apostles, the pillar of faith and the foundation of the Catholic Church, received the keys of the kingdom from our Lord Jesus Christ, the Savior and Redeemer of the human race, and that to this day and forever he lives and presides and exercises judgment in his successors, the bishops of the Holy Roman See, which he founded and consecrated with his blood." So I think, Christopher, what you've been saying, right, is that in that passage, okay, like it was known in every age that Peter had the keys from Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sure.
I mean,
right?
I don't. How could it not be? That's directly in the Gospel of Matthew. Yeah. So I don't want to say that there could be total ignorance concerning what it means for St. Peter to be a pope. I don't think there could be. There are certain things that St. Peter had to know, and I think certain things that the other apostles also knew concerning the nature of the papacy. But there were other things that they didn't, right? And I think, an exact formulation, for example, of the necessary and sufficient conditions of making an infallible ex cathedra statement, for example, is one of the things of which he might well have been ignorant. The church remains ignorant of the exact details on that right up until Vatican I. There's disagreement about what the necessary and sufficient conditions are, not just for a pope, but for a council as well. You don't get real clarity on that doctrinally until Vatican I. Let me take a few minutes just to say something about bad popes, and it's going to be very similar, because I think it's also a matter of having to know what the doctrine is before you can know what the doctrine predicts, and therefore know what would or would not count as evidence for or against the doctrine. And hopefully needless to say, that the church does not make any doctrinal claims about the sanctity of her popes in particular. I mean, the closest you get to that is that there is a doctrinal statement that the sacraments confer sanctifying grace, and that all else being equal, people with more sanctifying grace are holier than people with less sanctifying grace. But that doesn't really get you very far. And as far as it does get you, is actually confirmed by what we see in the popes, which is a multitude of great saints, martyrs, and doctors of the church. It certainly does not get you that there would be any minimal level of sanctity in any particular pope. I think this is the heart of the objection, right, is that there are some popes who are just so bad that they don't even meet these minimal standards for set down in the New Testament for holding episcopal office, for example. But of course, the theory, the doctrinal theory, just doesn't predict anything concerning the individual sanctity of popes, and it certainly doesn't set a minimum level of sanctity below which it would count as evidence of this person's not being the pope, that he doesn't reach this level of that he doesn't reach at least this level of sanctity. And I think insofar as you try to make that a necessary condition on being pope, you're engaged in a form of the famous heresy of Donatism, according to which the sacraments or authority of Christian ministers who are obstinate sinners is somehow diminished. I've had conversations with Jerry Walls in which he's claimed that this just concerns sacraments, sacramental power, but that's not right, at least not according to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church's understanding of Donatism has always been that it is also Donatist to call into question the ecclesiastical authority of sinful prelates, and not just their sacramental power. So what I want to emphasize concerning both of these objections is, regardless of what the history shows us, there is very little, if any, actual Catholic doctrine that predicts that we would see popes with elaborate papal courts in early Rome, or even exercising their episcopal jurisdiction in a very clear way. They have it. That doesn't mean they're necessarily exercising it in a very visible way. And that, with respect to bad popes, again, the theory just does not predict any minimal level of sanctity for individual popes. And insofar as one tries to make this a necessary condition of being a pope, one is engaged in what has historically been agreed to be a heresy.
And really, the bad popes argument is a form of the problem of evil. And why? If God's going to want this particular office, and he's going to use it to teach and to minister and to nourish the church, why would he allow such evil in the office at particular times? And so I think if you're like me, a skeptical theist, who doesn't think that we're in the position to judge, especially motivated by classical theism, right, where God's not a being, right? He is being, he is reality. Our understanding about him is analogical, right? Then it seems to me we're just not in a position to judge whether or not God would likely permit certain, in this case, pontiffs to act in certain ways or not. It's just beyond our ken with respect to what God would likely permit or not permit for some greater good.
Yeah, let me add to that, though, that it still does really matter what the relevant doctrine is. I don't think you could bring this kind of problem of evil or skeptical theist reply to the objection without in the presence of a doctrine that actually said that we should expect popes to be holy or whatever. So, for example, one of the church's dogmas is indefectibility, which I personally interpret to imply, among other things, that it could never be the case that every single bishop in the world is a heretic. So if you found out that every single pope in the world were a heretic, I think that would be like I don't think you could just say, well, that's part of the problem of evil, and I'm a skeptical theist. I think that actually would be strong evidence against the church, insofar as it shows that she appears to have defected, and she does teach that that's impossible. So there are certain kinds of evils, like defection of the whole church, that Catholic dogma does rule out, and which, if we were to find such an evil, we could not just say, oh well, skeptical theism. Who knows why God? Who knows what reasons God might have for allowing this? Because the question isn't why God would allow it. The question is, why would the church have taught that God wouldn't allow it?
If I may ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think, there are extremities where we need to be prepared to admit that a fatality is reached, right? I think what you're saying there with all the popes being heretical, even in their non-definitive teaching, all the way back from the first pope to the present, I think that would, if it doesn't reach a fatality of the belief system, then it at least calls it into so much question that it merits no credibility.
Yeah, just to clarify though, my claim was about all bishops in the world being heretical synchronically, not about all popes being heretical across time. Okay. Although I agree with you, yeah, if it turned out that every single pope was a heretic, that would also be a big problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that one of the we could, maybe this would be an extremity, but just let's look at the hypothetical situation if a pope were to put himself into some unknown, undisclosed location, but on live video record for the world to watch, and he came out and he said, I'm actually a crack lord and I run an underground human trafficking company, and I've been the source of all this kind of embezzling and theft and this and that, but I have a number of commands that I'm going to make. I'm going to change the liturgy here. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. So a pope would technically retain jurisdiction, even in the revelation of those kinds of things. And so some people might say, well, that's kind of incredible that the government of the church can't take an action against a sitting pope like that. And then if we don't obey all of his commands as he's presenting himself as a crack lord and a human trafficker, then we're in mortal sin because of disobeying legitimate jurisdiction. So I think, we can get real crafty with our imagination. I think there is a level where God does prevent a certain height of absurd evil that, maybe it's not theoretically an extremity that we can say is impossible, but I think it's reaching a height where it just seems so incredible that we could say that the general support of the Holy Ghost would not allow something like that. But anyway, that's a small point.
Yeah. So I think there are things that would be theoretically compatible with the constitution of the church, but which for other reasons God would not allow. And that might include things like we find out that the Pope is Walter White. And I mean, with respect to questions about jurisdiction in that case, I think, yes, he would retain jurisdiction and therefore, in theory, the power to do things like enact liturgical change or remove other bishops, whatever the case may be. However, this is where, I'm reminded of St. Thomas's advice about resisting prelates to their face. So yes, just because he has the authority doesn't mean we would be bound to obey in every circumstance. There could come about circumstances, I think, in which we would say, yes, you're the Pope. Yes, you have that authority in theory, but in practice, given these circumstances, we are going to resist. We think we're entitled to resist. And this is kind of like, for those who are familiar, right, the kind of position that organizations like SSPX and others take toward the current Pope. It's actually precisely the position they think they're in already. Obviously, I don't think any of that is justified. But if it turned out that the Pope was Walter White, then I might start getting a lot friendlier to SSPX.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to move on to our next section. And just real quick, so I guess basically what Christopher is saying is, if you're going to try to debunk what the Catholic Church teaches and actually know what the Catholic Church teaches and under what conditions it would fall apart. And then we also discussed a little bit what those conditions would actually look like. But, we didn't get too comprehensive, let's say. And I just wanted to share something, too, that was on my mind. So there's actually a paper by Jonathan D. Stuckert on Matthew 23, 1-3. And it talks about, how Christ says, obey the Pharisees, but don't act as they act. And then he basically says, in addition, there are instances of his direction in both the Old and New Testaments that reinforce this challenging path. It is through this more faithful stance that we grow and flourish in difficult times. So the argument is that the actual interpretation is that sometimes God just wants us to put up with bad leadership, and we just have to deal with it. And this is from Reformed Theological Seminary. So anyway, moving on then. Okay, so I'll do my case for the papacy. So let me share my screen because I have a PowerPoint presentation. And yeah, guys, just let me know, how's everyone doing on time? I just want to make sure that no one has to drop out in the middle. Is everything good?
We're good.
All right. All right, so then I will present the biblical case for the papacy. Let me start. All right. So, all right. Yeah, so with my Protestant background, I've always been really big on what the actual evidence for the papacy is. And I always, I was raised with sola scriptura, and I wanted to see, all right, could you make a case from the Bible? And I was actually very surprised at how good the case could be. So just to give you some background, I'm going to argue that that St. Peter's position in the church and to his successors is basically like the Davidic prime minister in the Old Testament. So in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 8-17, right, God forms the Davidic covenant and promises that David's kingdom will last forever through one of his sons. And God says in verse 14, this son will also be his son. In Luke 1:32, we explicitly get the Lord will give him the throne of his father David in reference to Christ. So Christ is going to rebuild the Davidic monarchy on the earth. That's part of the Davidic covenant. And as we see, there are multiple places in which Christ is called the son of David to allude to his royal ancestry and legitimacy to the throne. So then we can look at Isaiah 22:22, in which it says, then I will set the key of the house of David on his shoulder. This is in reference to Eliakim. When he opens, no one will shut. When he shuts, no one will open. In Matthew 16:19, we see this same kind of typological fulfillment. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, Christ speaking to St. Peter, and whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. So when we look at this passage, I think there's a pretty strong case that we have a typologically valid parallel. So one is that we have the structure being similar, in which keys are bestowed to someone and they have similar powers. In the case of Eliakim, he could decide basically who could open he would open the gate to allow the people to come in, or close the gate and say that you are not allowed to come in. The rabbis, with their binding and loosing power, also had the power to determine who could come into the temple and who had to be excluded from temple life. We have the same image where the recipient of the keys is likened to a secure object. In Isaiah 22, Eliakim is likened to a firm peg. In Matthew 16:18, Christ likens Peter to a rock. 3, we have a backdrop of corruption and purity. So in Isaiah 22, Eliakim replaces the corrupt Shebna. In Matthew 16:19, I think it's the Erdman's Bible commentary, talks about how in the general location of Caesarea Philippi, where this declaration occurs, there was a giant rock that was dedicated to the pagan deity Pam. I think it's either one of those. And the rock was also dedicated to Caesar by Herod the Great's son. I think it's Philip the Tetrarch, that was his name. So we see then that there's a theme here of where God is restoring order, and we're going from a state of corruption into a state of purity, and Christ declares that his rock, St. Peter, will be the foundation of his church and prevail against the pagan powers. Timing, so I think it's the HarperCollins Study Bible, NRSV, we learn that Eliakim gets the keys of the kingdom before the fall of Jerusalem. And likewise, in the New Testament, when the fall of Jerusalem happens in AD 70, we know that Peter gets also the keys to the kingdom of heaven before the fall of Jerusalem in his respective time. Number 5, Jesus and Isaiah. So Christ cites Isaiah 61, 1-2, Isaiah 58, 6, and Luke 4, 16, 21, when he declares he's the Messiah in the synagogue. So we see then that Christ already has a penchant for citing the book of Isaiah, and Matthew 16, 19 nicely fits into that motif. And then finally, I thought it was just kind of nice how, God in the Old Testament picks who the prime minister is going to be, and then God himself in the New Testament, incarnate in the Lord Jesus Christ, picks who the prime minister is going to be, St. Peter. And then we also have scholarly attestation of the validity of the typological parallel. So we have here by Gregory K. Beale and D.A. Carson in the commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament, the keys to the kingdom, Matthew 16:19, almost certainly is based on the identical metaphor in Isaiah 22:22. Likewise, in the New Bible Commentary, the phrase is almost certainly based on Isaiah 22:22, where Shebna the steward is displaced by Eliakim and his authority is transferred to him. Once again, by Oscar Cullman, just as in Isaiah 22:22, the Lord puts the keys of the house of David on the shoulders of his servant Eliakim, so does Jesus hand over to Peter the keys of the house of the kingdom of heaven, and by the same stroke establishes him as a superintendent. Mind you, from what I studied on the background of each of these authors, none of them are Catholic. All of them are either Protestant, non-Catholic of some sort. So this is almost a universal recognition among New Testament scholars that there is a valid typological parallel here to recognize. Likewise, we can start making the case for papal supremacy if Peter's the prime minister. So in Father Roland DeVoe's book, Ancient Israel, Its Life and Institutions, he talks about the position of Eliakim, specifically the prime minister or the master of the palace. So he says, in Israel, the powers of the master of the palace were far more extensive, and the similarity between his functions and those of the Egyptian vizier is even more important than the verbal resemblances. So this vizier used to report every morning to the pharaoh and receive his instructions. He saw the opening of the gates of the royal house, that is, of the various officers of the palace, and then the official day began. All the affairs of the land passed through his hands. All important decisions, documents received his seal. All officials were under his orders. This is obviously the dignity which Joseph exercised in the Old Testament according to Genesis. He had no one above him except the Pharaoh, and he was appointed over the whole land of Egypt. He held the royal seal, and to describe his dignity in the Bible says that Pharaoh put him in charge of his house. He made him, in fact, his master of the palace. So we see that the Israelites inherited some of the Egyptian structure of governance into their own Davidic monarchy, and this position has Egyptian origins. Likewise, we see from Nancy M. Tischler in All Things in the Bible that the Davidic prime minister was also master of the palace. And the descriptions that we have of the Egyptian vizier are very close to what we find in the Davidic monarchy, the historical record, etc. So another argument we could make then is that since we've established that Peter is a kind of steward or master of the house, right? We see that in Luke 12:42-48, Christ tells a parable about a good and faithful steward. Now he says this good steward is put in charge of or tasked to care for all the master's slaves and possessions, verse 44. And some translations literally call the steward the ruler of the household, the master perhaps of the palace. Now, I have two quotes from New Testament scholars that recognize that the steward was someone who was placed into power when the master left and was not totally in charge, right? And when the master was basically away. And the steward's main responsibility was to care for the other servants. And he would feed them, right, daily, weekly, or monthly, according to Darrell L. Bach. In the second quote I have here, we also see the same example repeated, where we see that the steward is one of the apostles. And then we also see that he is in charge of the other servants and he is himself a servant or a slave. And then finally, it's emphasized that this position is one of leadership. Now get this, Christ left the church to his apostles. He leaves us for a temporary time. He explicitly says this in John 16:7. So Christ is obviously the master in the circumstance, and he leaves the care of his flock to a steward. Now, Peter is also a fellow slave. He calls himself a fellow shepherd. Peter is Christ's oikonomos or steward. R.T. France in the Gospel according to Matthew specifically calls Peter Christ's oikonomos or steward. And the same word here to describe the role of the steward is oikonomos in the Greek. Finally, in John 21:15-17, Christ tells Peter, feed my sheep. The steward's job in the time of Christ was to feed the other servants. We see then a pretty strong indicator that the steward, probably St. Peter, was charged to take care of everyone else under the kingship of Christ. We can also go to the examples about papal supremacy in terms of the keys. So in the Jewish Annotated New Testament, published by Oxford's University Press, we see that the keys are linked to knowledge and authority. Once again, Alan C. Myers in the Erdman's Bible Dictionary talks about how in conferring upon Peter authority as head of the church, Jesus uses the rabbinical terms to bind and to loose. In rabbinic usage, the terms used to forbid and to permit with reference to interpretation of the law and so on. Thus, Peter is given the authority to determine the rules for doctrine and life by virtue of revelation and the subsequent leading of the Spirit, and to demand obedience from the church, reflecting the authority of the royal chamberlain or vizier in the Old Testament. So we see once again that the keys can justify a doctrine of papal supremacy. And then we can also go to Craig S. Keener, who talks about how the keys were also a symbol of authority, one of the most important roles that a servant could hold. And then likewise, R.T. France talks about how Peter is granted a daunting degree of authority. But of course, France is going to mention that, well, everyone got this authority, right? In Matthew 18:18, I have a response to that. So in Luke 22:31-32, we recognize that even though Satan is going after all the apostles, Christ specifically prays that Peter's faith will not fail. We can tell this because of the Greek. The Greek "sao," when Christ refers to Peter, is you singular. But when he talks about Satan is coming after you, he uses himos to signify you all or each of you. So in this case then, as I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but A. Edward Sienski, he recognizes that Jesus is isolating Peter in this case. Now, we see the same type of Greek construction in Matthew 16:19 and Matthew 18:18, where the apostles, right, they are given the authority also to bind and loose, and their decisions will be confirmed by heaven. And Christ uses himin, which is a variation of himos. And Peter specifically gets a variation of soy, or soy, to signify that he singularly gets this power. So if it holds in the one case, in Luke 22:31-32, I think it should hold also in the second case, in which you have the same basic structure, almost the same basic context, in which something affecting all the apostles, right, something affecting all the apostles is once again differentiated with this Greek construction. Now, that's a possible interpretation. Someone might say, well, look, even though Christ gave Peter the keys to the power to bind and loose, and also gave the apostles the power to bind and loose, this is something that he gave to everyone to act in a council. But when we look into the New Testament, especially in Acts chapter 5, we see that Peter actually does act alone once. He binds and looses once in the New Testament. And this is specifically when he rebukes Ananias and Sapphira. God backs his decision by striking them dead. So Peter's decision is backed by the kingdom of heaven. And if you're questioning, well, this is an example of Peter binding and loosing, according to Walter C. Kaiser and even F.F. Bruce in Hard Sayings of the Bible, they mention that the power to bind and loose also includes, right, forbidding certain kinds of activities and church discipline. And they say Peter specifically does use his power to bind and loose in this circumstance, and he's backed by heaven. So this is an instance where, even though Peter does act in a council in Acts 15, but as we've discussed before, like, James appeals to Peter when he makes his final declaration. Here, once again, Peter acts on his own, and heaven ratifies his decision. And then if we're going to talk about infallibility, I mean, just look at the passage, Matthew 16:19. It says that the decisions that Peter makes on earth shall have been bound in heaven. When Moses in Deuteronomy 30:19 calls upon heaven and earth, he's making the most solemn declaration that he can. And we know in Psalms 115:3, heaven is the dwelling place of God. So it seems to be the case that this is a strong indicator that this is an instance of infallibility being deployed here. And then if we want to talk about ex cathedra powers, right? Matthew 23:1-2, Christ talks about how the scribes and Pharisees have a legitimate authority because they're seated on the throne or chair of Moses. Now, when I looked at the ancient Jewish sources on the throne of Moses, what I found interesting was in the book, The Gospel of Matthew and Judaic Traditions, that we see particularly that the high court in Jerusalem, which was based on the throne of Moses and what the Pharisees had access to, right? They constituted the high court. They could make ex cathedra declarations based on biblical legislation. The Pharisees could demand the assent of the people. But likewise, on page 586, they also talk about how during Jesus's time, certain Jews questioned the authority of the Pharisees, but they said this. They said, if this is an authentic tradition, we have to accept it. But if it is a reconstruction of a ruling, we will disprove it. So when the Pharisees spoke in their official council and officially declared, right, using their binding and loosing powers, they had the assent of the Jewish people. But when the Pharisees began to go beyond their official jurisdiction and start kind of having informal traditions and pretending as if they were just as binding as an official declaration, that's when things became problematic. In Matthew 19, 27 to 28, and Luke 22, 28 to 30, the disciples are given thrones upon which they can judge Israel. This seems to be a direct connection back to the seat of Moses. And we can also talk about, too, throughout the Bible, how authorities are vested with special spiritual power. So in John 11, 51 to 52, Caiaphas, while he was high priest of the high court that year, had prophesied that Jesus would die for Israel and unite the children of God, despite the fact that he was in the Sanhedrin that crucified the Lord. The Jews viewed authority as also carrying with it special spiritual power. And likewise, we see that Peter is likened to a new high priest or a supreme rabbi. And so I'm running out of time a little bit, but I'm going to keep on going and just try to get through all my points. So in Judges 11, 27, 29, God says he will judge a case between Israel and the Ammonites. And then he sends Jephthah, right, one of the judges of Israel, established by the throne of Moses in Exodus and Deuteronomy. And it says in the scriptures that this judge, Jephthah, is filled with God's spirit and he judges accordingly. So we have instances then where God uses human beings to speak his will and rule over his people. And then Presbyterian scholar John Bright in The Kingdom of God, he talks about how the judges well represented the primitive theocracy of Israel. It was the direct rule of God over his people through his designated representative. Infallibility is presupposed throughout the Bible, especially when it comes to authorities who are exercising their official functions in particular. And then this book here by Roger David Oss, he's a Lutheran scholar, and he argues that Christ commissioned Simon Peter as his successor. Let me repeat that. This is a Lutheran scholar who recognized that Christ commissions Peter as his successor in John 21, 15, 19. So how do we know this? Well, one is that we know that Christ is the new Moses and Davidic shepherd. There's a rabbinic saying that calls Moses the first redeemer, and it says, as it was with the first redeemer, so it shall be with the final redeemer. We see throughout different midrashes throughout history that David takes care of three kinds of sheep. And likewise in John 21, 15, 19, Christ uses the image of those three sheep once again. When Moses hands over his flock to Joshua, he calls Israel baby lambs and sheep and mentions the other three kinds of sheep once again. This is in the Tanaic Midrash, Sifra 305 on Deuteronomy. Moses prays in Numbers 27, 16 to 17, that the people will not be like sheep without a shepherd after his death. Christ also looks on compassion with certain people and says they look to him like sheep without a shepherd. So there's a typological connection then between Moses and Christ. And then we see that God tells Moses to commission his main disciple Joshua to be a successor. Christ commissions Peter, his main disciple, to be a successor. And there are different just examples, and if anyone's watching, they can pause this and look at the examples that I offer. But I want to also emphasize that in the Testament of Moses, the Sifra 305, and the Peteret Moshe, the Jewish tradition during the time of Jesus held that Moses gave Joshua his throne / the throne of Moses. If the typological parallel holds and Peter can be compared to a new Joshua, then Peter himself received the throne of Moses as well, if Christ represents the second or new Moses. We can talk about how Peter's the rock, but I mean, this has been settled since 1985 in the late 70s. There's just no question anymore that Peter's the rock. And I mean, some people say, that's really controversial. Pause the video, look at the quotes. And then we can talk about too, apostolic succession in terms of First Clement, how Paul tells us to abide by the traditions, either oral or written. And we have a very reliable instance in the first century where Clement of Rome, who's mentioned in the Bible, I think in Philippians 4:9 by Paul as his name being in the book of life. First, Clement of Rome tells us that the disciples, the early apostles, practiced apostolic succession. So if you're going to accept the infallibility of Scripture on the one hand when it tells us to obey the oral and written traditions, you had better obey it when we have the oral tradition finally written down. And that's my case for the papacy from the Bible. All right. So that's like 18 minutes. So we have like 12 minutes left. So ask any questions.
So I was just going to say two things. First, thanks for the presentation. I thought that summarized a lot of really good points. Yeah. So two things. One, in reference to why Peter has the keys, possesses the keys, you know, in a special way, more so than the other apostles, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the instances of Acts, like, so to complement your reference to Ananias and Sapphira, in Acts 2, Peter is there to sort of open the gates, so to speak, for the Jews. Later on, I think is it Philip or there's someone who basically the Spirit's not falling on the Samaritans, and who do they call? Peter and John, and then they come along and the Spirit falls, and then with the Gentiles in Acts 10, right? It's the same sort of thing. Peter is the prime character in Acts 10, where the Spirit comes on the Gentiles and sort of ushers them into the kingdom. So you have the three types of people, right? Jews, Samaritans, Gentiles, and it seems like Peter plays an extremely pivotal role in all three of them coming into the kingdom of God. And so it does seem like that the New Testament presents Peter, as you said, in this sort of special way. So if someone's wondering, well, is Matthew 16 really no different than Matthew 18? Well, look at Acts, and you can see the answer is yes. And then the other thing I was going to mention real quick, infallibility. The early church saw, if you read some of the fathers and some of the early patristic writings, like the early church saw themselves as infallible. The church got the truth. The church wasn't in error. And so if you buy the view that Peter is this sort of prime minister, he's the lead of the church, right? If you buy these other arguments, well, then by extension, right, we should expect Peter to be infallible, I think. So if you're already committed to the church being infallible, and you're already committed to Peter being the prime minister, so to speak, of that church. So it doesn't seem to be a big stretch there. Yeah, I just wanted to throw those two things out to complement your case as well.
Yeah, if I could just say something real quick too, like, some people want to say that all the apostles got the keys to the kingdom, but if the typological parallel holds that the keys represent the authority of the prime minister, then only one person could have gotten them, right?
Exactly.
And then also, the terms of binding and loosing were very familiar during Christ's time. So, like if Christ said, Peter, whatever you open shall be open, whatever you shut shall be shut, and then he says the same thing in Matthew 18:18, then I could see the case that the keys were likewise given to the other apostles. But because Christ uses the keys and then he switches to binding and loosing, I think that shows us that there's something unique about the keys themselves, that Christ kept that particular part of Isaiah 22:22, but then used another rabbinic term, right, for Peter and all the apostles. There was something else I was going to say. Oh, when it comes to like authority, I also just wanted to point out, and I'm sorry that I didn't get to this clearly, but basically in Numbers 27:20, when Moses anoints Joshua to be a successor, it says that he receives some of his authority. And in Deuteronomy 34:9, it says that Joshua at that moment was filled with the spirit of wisdom, and he gained the authority to teach after Moses. So that theme is continued in, the Acts of the Apostles in the early church. And I think it also gives them a gift from the spirit of wisdom, the Holy Spirit, to teach infallibly. Christ is the new Moses. He continues the throne of Moses, all the stuff that happened there. I would be in total agreement. Yeah. All right. Does anybody else?
Well, in my own personal studies, one of the objections that is due to come up is that, throughout the patristic era, as well as in some of the ecumenical councils, the disjointing of the keys and the powers of binding and loosing are not clearly attested. For example, in some of the Second Millennium councils, Council of Lateran 1215, if I'm not mistaken, it does refer to the keys as in the possession of priests, for example, because binding and loosing, absolving sins, in other words, is a utility of the keys. and not just a utility of its own, in other words. But at the same time, we can still preserve the hierarchical distinction that you're trying to make there, because there has to be a reason why Christ gave the keys to Peter in a singular way, and then later spoke about this plurality of usage. And I think the patristic era and the councils, and then all the way up to Vatican I, have recognized that there is a hierarchical principle to the keys. So just like within the local diocese, if the bishop has the power of the keys to absolve sins, so does the priest. So do the priests when they hear confessions. But nobody's going to say that the keys of the presbyter can overrule the keys of the bishop, in other words. So the bishop has some sort of a discriminant prerogative in his use of the keys. And I would say that the singularity that given to Peter is a certain kind of entrustment. He's given the caretaking of the keys. So he has, so what is singular to Peter would be the supremacy of authority, the fullness, as the plenitudo potestas, the fullness of power. But it could also be understood in the sense that the episcopate and the other functions of different governors in the church, they also have that power to bind and loose, but it's not a binding and loosing that can contest or challenge when St. Peter definitively uses them. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, and just to buttress your point too, I mean, oftentimes when I read Protestant commentaries on John 21:15-19, they'd say something like, well, Peter is kind of almost viewed as like this head shepherd successor after Christ, but then Peter calls the other bishops and apostles, right, fellow shepherds, right? So this means then that, okay, yeah, it wasn't specifically given to Peter. There's nothing unique about him. But I mean, if the typological parallel holds between Moses and Joshua, then we see something unique happening with St. Peter. But as you stated, like everyone kind of has a derivative authority maybe from the first, from Peter himself. And that doesn't mean that you can destroy the uniqueness of what was given to Peter, even though you can say that everyone was given a power analogous to what was originally first given to Peter. Does that sound a fair characterization?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, the analogy there that you made was perfect, because that's kind of what St. Leo the Great, basically said, that all bishops are analogous to St. Peter's relationship to the apostles, but there's only one peculiar successor who has the fullness of inheritance of what Peter had. Yeah.
Let me add to that, Eric, that I guess certainly in the case of priests, when you're talking about their faculties, for example, to forgive sins, it's not just that they can't exercise those powers in a way that is inconsistent with the bishop's will concerning how he'd like the power to be exercised, but that at every moment, their faculties to forgive sins, for example, flow from and are grounded in the authority of the bishop in a way that absent the bishop, they don't really even have that authority at all, and the bishop can take it away at his pleasure. So this happens in the Catholic Church on a fairly frequent basis. Priests can be suspended, and when they get suspended, it's not just that they're not permitted to hear confessions. Confessions that they hear under suspension are invalid. So at least that's the Catholic take on it. And you see something similar with like the relationship of the Curia in the Vatican to the Pope. When the Pope dies, almost everybody in the Curia, by the very fact of his death, loses their office, with just a couple of exceptions that are stipulated in law. But everybody else loses their position and has to be reinstated by the subsequent Pope. Let me, and Suan, to add to your typological argument, which I thought was excellent. the parallel between King David in 1 Chronicles 28 and St. Peter in Acts 15, where both of the, so obviously in 1 Chronicles 28, King David is calling a kind of council to plan for the construction of the temple. And in Acts 15, St. Peter is presiding at the Council of Jerusalem, which is aimed at providing for the construction of the church. So there's a construction of the temple, construction of the church parallel, and there's verbal parallels in what King David says at the 1 Chronicles 28 meeting and what St. Peter says in the Acts 15 meeting. St. David says, God chose me, and St. Peter says something very similar, which gets translated in the Douay Rheims at least as God chose my mouth. But you get that God chose me parallel comes through very clearly, where King David is talking about the construction of the temple, St. Peter's talking about the construction of the New Testament church. I've found that very powerful.
Yeah, and if I can just add one thing, and then this will actually be a perfect segue to Tyler's part of the presentation. One is that in Acts 15, right, it says the most important, I think, elders or disciples, right, showed up to this council in Jerusalem. In 1 Chronicles 28, it also says the most important men in Israel showed up to the council. And
right.
And yeah, you mentioned King David and Peter. What was the other thing I was going to say? So in 1 Chronicles 28, David says, though the Lord has chosen like my house, right, to be the one through which the temple will be built, he says, the Lord will not let me see the completion of the temple because I'm a man of war. I've shed human blood, right? So you could probably make the argument that the reason why Peter didn't see, let's say, the full, breadth of his papal supremacy, right, was because, remember, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he cut off the ear of the servant and he shed innocent blood. So if there's a parallel between Peter and King David there, then there could be a possibility why we don't see Peter receive the full knowledge, let's say, of his papal supremacy immediately, even though there are inklings of it and it's planted there, just as it was planted in King David's case.
Yeah.
All right, and with that, Tyler, take it away. So Tyler's going to present now on papal improbabilities and epistemology.
Suan, I have to go. So it's been really great being with you guys. I hope that Erick and Tyler, you guys kill it.
Yeah.
And I look forward to seeing what you had to say, but yeah, I have to go. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, appreciate what you share. It was very helpful.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
All right, Tyler, when you start talking, I'll start the timer.
All right, I'm starting to talk. What oftentimes is referenced in this sort of context about whether or not there's evidence for a special bishop in Rome, let's call it, are four texts. So specifically, Jerry, who's a great friend of mine, in his articulation of this version of the argument, he mentions Shepherd of Hermes, Ignatius, Justin Martyr, and Clement of Rome. And so he mentions these four texts as the best sort of text, or the most likely of all the texts that would mention there being a special bishop in Rome, and they'll have different connections to Rome. Obviously, Clement of Rome has a really special connection. But Jerry's absolutely right that there are a lot of early church historians who are in the Catholic tradition, who say that there was no special bishop in Rome, or there is no evidence for there being a special bishop in Rome. So, and so the idea is that we would expect a mention in one of these texts of a special bishop in Rome, but we don't. And so this is evidence against there not being a special bishop in Rome. This is a very rough caricature of the argument, representation of the argument. Yeah. So I don't think that's necessarily the case. So I think it's just kind of unclear overall. So if you date Clement of Rome to 70 AD, 69, 68 AD, which, for example, is becoming, I think, a bit more popular now to do. My former colleague, Michael Kona, dates Clement of Rome to around this time. Clement of Rome obviously wouldn't have been would have been the bishop or the special bishop. So you wouldn't have expected Clement of Rome to talk about his office, right? So one of the accusations, like, hey, if you read Clement of Rome, it's not like Clement of Rome is telling everyone that they ought to obey him because he has some special authority. Well, around 68 AD, right? I mean, Peter and Paul would have just died. So it's not like Clement of Rome would have had this particular office. You would have had to have time anyway to have some development of doctrine, as you mentioned, or as Christopher mentioned also earlier. Shepherd of Hermes, it's really hard to date. It's really popular to date, a good portion of it at a later date than the early portion of it. The early portion of it does mention a Clement who basically seems to be some sort of secretary role. But again, if you date early part of Shepherd of Hermes, just around the similar date of Clement of Rome, well, then Clement of Rome would have been basically, very well could have been some sort of like secretary elder, right? And maybe wasn't at the time this really special bishop of Rome. When it comes to Ignatius, early part of the 2nd century, Ignatius does mention special bishops, right? He mentions bishops and all of his writings. And how we ought to obey the bishops, and how you don't have a church without the bishop, right? And so he makes this pretty clear, except in his letter to the Romans, as Jerry points out, he doesn't mention the office of the bishop. He does say that he does make it seem like that only the Romans can stop him from being a martyr. He does talk about how they're first in love, right? So he does seem to have a really big role for the Roman church, but nonetheless, he doesn't mention a bishop of Rome. So should we take this silence as evidence that there wasn't a special bishop in Rome? And I don't think that's the case. In fact, I think you can sort of make the opposite sort of argument, because again, if he thinks that you're not a church without a bishop, right? And yet he not only seems to consider the Romans to have a church, but to have a really special place in their teaching, presiding first in love, then it seems to me really implausible to think that, Ignatius is telling everyone else you're not a church if you don't have a bishop, and then he gives this really special role to the Romans and their authority and teaching structure and so forth. So and then you get to Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr, early apologist, doesn't mention a bishop in Rome, but I mean, he's an apologist, he's a philosopher, right? I mean, up until recently, all my published work never mentioned a special bishop in Rome, or my Catholic faith more specifically, right? And just a little bit later than Justin Martyr, Irenaeus. Irenaeus discusses specific bishops, right? That follow Peter, particular successors. And so are we going to say that just a little bit of time, say 30, 40 years after Justin Martyr, Irenaeus comes onto the scene and just totally botches the history, right? Totally reads completely his particular context into what was going on just 30, 40 years ago? Like, is he that incompetent? And that seems implausible to me. And so looking at the 4 texts earlier, Justin Martyr, Ignatius, Clement of Rome, Shepherd of Hermes, should we really expect to see a special bishop in Rome? It's not clear to me. The early history to me is underdetermined to me. It's not very clear one way or the other. I do think maybe you can make some sort of case in the Ignatius point that I brought out, and you would have to sort of bite a bullet about Irenaeus and his competency. Nonetheless, so let's say like the evidence one way or the other is not super strong either way, right? that's to me not super problematic. Linda Zabzewski, in her book on epistemic authority, talks about how we can be justified in accepting the testimony or the authority of a particular community if by accepting that testimony or authority, we're going to be in a better position, right? We're going to believe more true things, and we're going to believe fewer false things, right? And so, in that case, and moreover, she argues that it's a better community, so to speak, if the community is long-standing, right? But oftentimes, in our own time frame, we are blinded by the spirit of the age, right? We don't see certain things that other generations saw. And so, having this long-standing community, right? The Catholic community is, even if you want to say the real Catholic Church was founded in the 2nd century or 3rd century, right? I mean, it's still, 17, 1800, 2000 years old, right? I mean, it's a long-standing community, and she talks about how that there would be leaders in these communities who could rightly apply the community's teachings or beliefs up into the current age. And so when she talks about this sort of thing, I mean, when I think about the Roman Catholic Church, and I'm sure she's indirectly thinking about it, or at least has that in mind as one particular example among others, it seems to me that we'd be absolutely within our epistemic right if we saw the testimony of the church. The church can see things we can't, right? The church has had access to many more documents than we have access to, right? The church has particular memories that we don't have, right? Because we exist in the 21st century. So the church has access to evidence and resources that we don't have access to. And so if the historical evidence that we have access to isn't really clear one way or the other, it's kind of a wash, nonetheless, we can be justified in believing the church's claims about there being a special bishop in Rome, about there being a successor to Peter. We can be justified in accepting the church's testimony if overall, by accepting the church's testimony or authority, right, we're going to believe more true things than false propositions. And so, yes, that seems to me to be the case. That I'm overall in a better position in accepting the church's testimony, and it has access to things that I don't. And so, I'm going to trust the testimony and authority of the church. And this is really practical to me because when I was an evangelical philosopher, I believed in libertarianism, political libertarianism of the Nozick stripe, right? I believed in theistic personalism, right? The idea that God is a maximally great person who's constituted by various properties and who's mutable and so on and so forth, passable. And then later on, I ended up rejecting these two views independently of my acceptance of Rome's authority. And I there's long stories of explaining about how I came to these conclusions and so forth. But the idea was very it really hit home, so to speak, because I've realized that the Catholic Church had it right on both accounts. On classical theism, and that political libertarianism wasn't a good idea, wasn't a good theory. And so they're the Catholic churches all along, right in its historic proclamations as it's always been. And here I am trying to figure out everything by myself, given the limited resources and limited brain capacity that I have, and getting it really wrong about something that the church has always believed in reference to classical theism. And so, so it seems really, really right to me that's the case. And so, yeah, that would be, I think that succinctly, hopefully summarizes where I see the historical evidence and where I see the church's authority and the church's perception of the evidence and all of this.
All right, yeah, you only use like 12 minutes, so we have a lot of time for conversation. Erick, I know that you're more of like the history buff, So I want you to kind of come in and see if you have any comments or
Well,
questions.
yeah, I mean, I love history, but um, my talents on it are another issue. So there's a couple things I wanted to say here. The issue of addressing oneself in a letter, like Clement to the Church of Rome. Um, you know, not only is what the reasons that Tyler gave were excellent, but just to add to that, you have Saint Peter himself, who's an apostle, who, when he wrote to the diaspora Jews in First Peter, or I think it's First Peter, he says he says, I'm a fellow elder. He calls himself a fellow elder. Um, and so, but all Protestants agree that Peter was an apostle who had superior standing.
Right.
So it's quite compatible for somebody who's in a higher position to, in their address of themselves or their standing, try to make an equation with the addressees for the sake of humility. So if we see that in the Apostle Peter already in an earlier date, I don't think it's such a far stretch, and I don't think it would be bizarre, or it would raise question marks as to why a superior would do this something similar, at least in how he's disposing himself to that congregation. I think what's more bizarre is for somebody to say, well, we should see him say, I am the successor of Peter, the Pope of the Universal Church. And I think that's probably more off kilter of an expectation. So that's that point. The other point I wanted to make was that Tyler was absolutely right, that St. Ignatius of Antioch stated quite explicitly that a church cannot be reduced less than the trifold order of bishop, presbyters, and deacons. He says in his epistle to the to the church in Tralee, the Trallians, he says, without these three, you don't have a church. And yet when he writes to the Romans, he says to the church at Rome. So if you have an irreducible conditionality for the church in terms of a bishop, presbyters, and deacons, and then he refers to Rome as church, it seems to be, again, very off kilter for him to make such an irreducible conditionality that has to be for a church, and then go ahead and make the mistake of referring to Rome, who he purposefully omits from the word bishop because he supposedly doesn't think they have one bishop. That just seems so absurd. And then the other thing I want to say was that in terms of scholarship on where Peter was, there's very good scholarship to say that Peter made it to Rome. I mean, just from a historical lens, I'm totally on board with the lens that Tyler described, where if you're in a community, there's the vantage point that the church has on all these blind spots is superior than us, right? But the way it is in the halls of academia, they really chop you down to that limit of the documents, but there's really good evidence that Peter was in Rome. Well, Peter was in Antioch first. Everybody knows that, or if he went to Rome, he went to Antioch right after that quickly, and he led the church there. And, he appointed Evodius, as the tradition says, he appointed Evodius to be the bishop of Antioch. And then Ignatius was in Evodius's successor. So where does Ignatius get this idea of a monarchical bishop? If his predecessor was Evodius, whose predecessor was Peter, it's very likely that the Antiochian school is where Ignatius got the monoepiscopate idea from. And if Peter was the president there, for which tradition says 7 years, it seems very clear, or it's not like it's not clear cut evidence, but the kind of evidence is certainly it's certainly substantial evidence. And then if Peter goes to Rome to lead the church there, why would he have a different tradition to deposit at Antioch than at, like he had switched his decision on how the church should be run? That's that's more unlikely. That seems to be less convincing. And then the last thing is that when Ignatius writes to Rome, he opens up that letter to Rome saying, to the Church of the Romans, who presides over the district of the Romans. It's quite possible that the reason why Ignatius didn't mention a bishop at Rome is because Rome had a very unique situation. I think there was several different house churches, larger congregations, where you had to actually have more bishops in the city, but that within that collectivity, there was one who was sort of like the early prototype of an archbishop, who would have been understood as the normative successor of St. Peter. But it would have been kind of odd to refer to one bishop in a letter that everyone knows is going to be circulated amongst several congregations in Rome. So the Church of Rome that presides in the district of the Romans seems to be more of a metropolitical, one church, but sort of several congregations. So I think that that's a good explanation for why Ignatius didn't mention, one bishop.
Yeah, my favorite response to the point about Ignatius, about the point being discussed, where he seems to make a big deal about you're not a church unless you have a bishop, but then he seems to address the Romans as if they're like not just a church but a really great church, right? This sort of point. My favorite response is, well, yeah, he's just trying to like flatter them, and he's trying to like persuade them to do what he wants, and so he's talking them up, so to speak, and you get that sort of response. That's my favorite sort of response.
Yeah, I mean, I was just also going to add one thing to what Tyler and what Erick have said so far, which is just kind of going back to kind of the time before Christ showed up on the scene. I think you had the Maccabean revolt, and you had various pre-Christ messianic figures who rose up, and they were trying to lead movements in the desert. And when the Romans found out who was leading the movement, they killed first, the guy who was at the top, so that they could destroy the whole movement. So in the early church, if you're going to have one guy just stand up all of a sudden, and let's say he has the Pope hat, all the vestments, and he says, I am the bishop of the universal church, the Romans know who to kill now and to destroy the whole Christian movement. So I think that it's to the advantage of the church that the early successor of Peter, the bishop of Rome, the head of the universal church, would have been kind of somewhat under the wraps a little bit, but you could still identify, as tradition has it, who was the successor of Peter, who was meant to be the bishop of Rome, and so forth. I mean, this was a great portion. Do you have anything else to add, Erick or Tyler?
I'm good.
So we've settled the issue, huh?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I mean, the other thing I could say is that the early episcopal government of the church, it's such in a conservative society like the early Christians, to introduce something that is sort of like a post-apostolic creation, but then treat it like an apostolic creation, that just seems so out of place for a religious conservative society like the early Christians, where the smallest things caused an uproar amongst the churches. So the idea that, there was a plurality of elders at one time, and then we decided to heap one of them up to, for a pragmatic organizational purposes, but then we're going to talk about it as if it's divine origin, that seems out of place. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it gets back to also the point I made about Irenaeus, about him being incompetent, basically, because, just 40 years ago, right, there wouldn't have been a special bishop in Rome, if this theory is true, right? And yet he doesn't realize that, he doesn't know it. He's not being a very good um, early church source by any means. And in a similar way with Ignatius, right? You have to believe that Ignatius is like propping the church up, so to speak, in order to get what he wants. And so it's just like it's oftentimes it accompanies sort of a low view of the early church and the patristic minds. And to me, that's just sort of an implausible sort of view, a view that I take to be prima facie implausible. So.
All right, well, with that, I think I'm ready to move on to the next subject. Tyler, how much time do you have left? I just want to be careful with that.
Yeah.
Could you run for like
11:30.
Okay. Could you do like
that's 11 or 10:30 Central Time.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So we still got a lot of time. All right. Eric, talk to us about the Eastern Orthodox. And here, like, I'll let you go a little overtime if you want to,
Oh, no, that's okay. Yeah. So, all this stuff seems so convincing. And then until an Orthodox priest comes into the room, well, certainly the Orthodox may take a lot of objection to what has been said hitherto. But generally speaking, more progressive, more scholarly minds within the Orthodox Church today are disposed to admit that Peter was unique. He was the prince and head of the apostles. You don't really see scholarly Orthodox pulling out a sword on those issues. But the issue of lineal succession, certainly the issue of a coercive jurisdiction over other bishops and other churches is going to be a point of contention. So, moving into the patristic data, one of the first episodes that we have of a bishop of Rome sort of exemplifying, foreign power, over a diocese other than his own, is in the Quartodeciman controversy, where the churches were a bit out of place on when to celebrate Pascha, when the fast should begin and end, and what day the Lord's resurrection should be celebrated. It came to a point where the Bishop of Rome was calling synods to be held, and one of the synods that he called was led by a certain Saint Polycrates of Ephesus. He was the bishop of Ephesus, but he led this council in Asia Minor. And out of all the other councils that were held in Corinth, in Gaul, in Jerusalem, Palestine, all of them agreed that Easter should be on the Sunday of the week that the 14th day of Nisan falls. So that way everybody worships the Lord's resurrection on the same day. But this one synod decided that they were going to follow the old tradition, what they thought was an older tradition, and a Jewish tradition. And the Bishop of Rome basically began to put a stricture on it and made some sort of enforcement, to which that synod, headed by Saint Polycrates, who's a saint, in both East and West communions, basically thumbed his nose at the Pope. He basically said that we have our own tradition here. We have the witness and patrimony of Saint John. We have many other lights who have fallen asleep who did it this way. So we're going to keep going with what we do. And then in response to this, Victor responded with attempting to excommunicate these churches in Asia Minor. And so the Orthodox might look at this and say, well, if the Pope of Rome had this kind of authority, then it should have been instantaneously obeyed. So that's one objection. This another like it would come up in Saint Cyprian of Carthage in the 3rd century. Here's the Bishop of Carthage. He is confronting certain divisions going on in North Africa and in Rome over receiving penitents back into the church who come from heretical sects. And in particular, he believes that when somebody who was baptized in a heretical sect but came to the true church afterwards, they should be rebaptized or baptized afresh for the first time. And Rome certainly fell on the opposite side, that validity of baptism even outside the church was authentic if done in a certain way, and rebaptizing would be actually a serious sin. And Cyprian of Carthage, again, sort of, long story short, basically tells the Pope that he's wrong and he's not going to follow through with, in fact, the Pope sent out an edict, basically, to enforce the Roman tradition of not rebaptizing. And it looks like Cyprian not only thumbed his nose in a private letter, but also held a council in 257 at which he said, this is something that we as bishops are free to decide upon. So, objection would go, the Orthodox would say this is 250, this is, plus 100 plus years after the foundation of the church. If there was something like a universal jurisdiction, papal infallibility, papal supremacy, et cetera, Cyprian could not have fathomed employing this kind of disobedience to it. So that's an objection. Another objection would be because I want to keep this to the early centuries, the Council of Constantinople in 381 was held. Obviously it was more of a local synod at the time, but in its 3rd canon, it launched the idea that Constantinople as a church should rank right under Rome because it's New Rome. Of course, the internal logic there is that Old Rome received its rank because of its secular preeminence, sort of like the church using the Roman geopolitical model as a way to rank churches. Rome got rank 1 because of that. Constantinople is New Rome, so there's a collision here. What's going to happen? Well, Constantinople is going to be ranked first after Old Rome because it's New Rome. So those are 3 really good objections in the early patristic era. It's how should we respond to this? Well, to Victor of Rome, the situation there, number one, just the fact that the Pope of Rome would make such a movement is certainly evidence of a consciousness of responsibilities outside of the Roman territory. And Saint Victor is also a saint in Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholicism. So Saint Polycrates is a saint. He did, he did show resistance to this. But you have a resistance, and then you also have the coercive authority showing itself. So now you've got a duality. You don't just have, everybody saying, well, the Pope doesn't have authority here. You have the Pope saying he has the authority. So there's that witness. And then you have the witness of one of the synods saying no to one of his commands. Well, the first thing to be said is that rejection of valid authority is not the proof of its non-existence or of its illegitimacy. And the proof of that is that several bishops disliked what the Pope was doing at this time, and yet as their objection, they did not point to the illegitimacy of St. Victor's movement. They said that it was imprudent. This is kind of verging on rigidity. They were appealing to those kinds of arguments rather than to natural arguments like, hey, are you nuts? You don't have the authority to do this. So, it's a situation which the resolution at the time ended with the Pope's relenting. We think that's what happens because of what Eusebius, the historian, tells us. We don't really know exactly how it ended, other than there was peace that came to the situation. But a Pope's relenting from his strict rule is not evidence of him succumbing to the idea that he doesn't have that authority. So you have a couple of things going on there in that situation, but nothing seems very conclusive. You have this instance of the Pope showing evidence that he has universal jurisdiction. You have one synod showing resistance. That doesn't mean that the resisting synod is automatically the trophy winner and proves that their whole disposition was right. But you still have that early evidence of Roman jurisdiction, which is what ended up surviving as time went on. Cyprian of Carthage, this is a dreadful situation, but again, you have this instance of Rome showing that the consciousness of a coercive jurisdiction and responsibility in North Africa, far outside of the Italian peninsula. And this is not even under we're not even in the era of patriarchs and metropolitical oversight. This is North Africa. These are churches outside of Rome. And he shows this evidence, and he's also a saint in Orthodox churches, Saint Stephen of Rome. So what you have here are two positions being upheld. That doesn't mean that both are necessarily wrong, right? Because it seems like in a lot of this, sometimes the Orthodox will say, well, there was a voice of resistance, as if the voice of resistance gets jam-packed with all the credibility, and then the voice of Roman supremacy is depleted of its credibility. Well, that's gratuitous, right? One of them is right, one of them is wrong, or they're both wrong. But let's not cast out the Roman position just because there was a voice of resistance. But what we can say is that Saint Cyprian's ecclesiology did support a Roman primacy, although he didn't see the full extent of the sacred rights of the occupant of St. Peter's See. But his fundamental ecclesiology, this is confirmed by one of the foremost Cyprianists of the English-speaking world today, Dr. Alan Brent, who was an Anglican up until about 2013, I believe. He converted to Rome after being a prestigious scholar in early patristic studies. He admits that St. Cyprian, and this is when he was an Anglican, St. Cyprian of Carthage had a fundamental theory of episcopal government, which did hold a special place for the Bishop of Rome. Even an Eastern Orthodox scholar, an ecclesiologist, the late Father Nicholas Avanasiev, recognized that Saint Cyprian had this universal, this universal primacy. The Cyprian had this understanding of the successor of Peter. All bishops were the successor of Peter, but there is a successor par excellence who has some sort of uniqueness, but Cyprian didn't connect all the dots. And so because of those dots floating around, he thought he could resist one of the injunctions. The last thing, Canon 3 of Constantinople 381, this is a touchy subject, but let's just put it this way. There's two reasons to reduce the persuasive force of this argument. The first thing is that Rome certainly did have a primacy over the Roman territory, the Italian peninsula, because of its secular prestige. The church was sort of adopting the geopolitical plane as a way to plot where head churches would be. So if you had a province, the metropolis of that province would end up having the metropolitan, who ended up being the head of that province. So you had that all over, from all over the Greco-Roman world. In Rome, you have Rome having a big archbishop metropolitical church. So it's quite possible that when I got you 1 minute left. Yeah, it's quite possible that when that they were floating that third canon, that all they were seeking to do was to grow Constantinople into a larger metropolitical church, or a quasi-patriarchal church in the East. So in that case, it's not really even talking about Rome's universal service. It's talking about Rome's patriarchal service, which is limited and which was based off of imperial decrees or imperial standing. So, and then the other thing is, this canon gets floated again in Chalcedon 451, but it gets severely challenged by the Pope and ends up getting shot down, even the Eastern Church recognizing that. So Rome, Alexandria, Constantinople, and the emperor ended up giving up on this canon under the authority of St. Peter. So there's so much more to say, but those are some, three common objections that you get from Orthodox and early church, and some of the possible responses.
And that seems to me like what you would expect, right? If what we're saying is true, where you have papal doctrine as part of the deposit of faith, but it's like a seed, right? And it develops, and different heresies and different people objecting, just like the deity of Christ, right? Just like the triune nature of God comes along. These heresies or objections come along. Not everyone's connecting the dots in the same way, and it forces the church to clarify its particular views on the matter. And so it seems to me that, like, with whether it be Cyprian, as you mentioned, or the last thing you just mentioned, it seems like, yeah, you would expect these sorts of dots to be missing and needing to be connected, granting the view about development of doctrine. And so I think it fits quite nicely with that. But my question for you, and I really enjoyed your presentation, thank you. The question for you, I don't know if you've read David Bentley Hart's Myth of Schism.
Yes, many years ago.
But,
yeah.
Yeah. So in it, he basically is like, he seems to affirm exactly what you said about there not being substantial doctrinal differences on a lot of doctrines that people think are really in question when it comes to orthodoxy versus Catholicism. And so just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so David Bentley Hart wrote that, and I remember at the time reading it, I was kind of floored. It was so revolutionary at the time for me to read something like that. And what I would say is that the Orthodox Church has, they're saying that they're the church of the seven great councils, right? And every heresy or schismatic that came up of serious weight, like Arius, Nestorius, Dioscorus, the Iconoclasts, the Miaphysite, or the Monothelites, those were all handled in an ecumenical council. So an arch heretic like Arius and Nestorius, they were brought to the court of an ecumenical council. Their beliefs were described, condemned, and then all of the holders were anathematized. So the Orthodox Church has built up this pedigree of having an ecumenical court adjudicate heresies and excommunicate. Well, the thing is, the Orthodox Church has never called an ecumenical court to condemn Rome. This is a very significant issue here. Why? Why not? I mean, this is the most significant break in church history. one would argue that it probably supersedes all of the previous ones. And yet the Orthodox really don't have an official anathema on Roman Catholic doctrine, nor do they have an official anathema on a Roman Catholic, like they would the Arians. The Arians, they had Arius in the books. Arius was, when they used to chant their heretics, Arius, Nestorius, they don't have a Roman Catholic in their catalog of heresy. So one wonders what kind of level of authority the Orthodox resistance to Rome has in light of that. So that's why you have a lot of Orthodox theologians who feel free to be very well disposed to doctrines like papal supremacy, albeit more conditioned. Filioque, the enzymes in the bread of Holy Mass. If I didn't say purgatory already, purgatory, the beatific vision, a number of other issues that have come up in tension over the centuries. You have a lot of Orthodox theologians that are willing to say that we're like 99% in agreement. So on the other hand, you have a lot who their epistemology is different. They think that ecclesial certainty or doctrinal certainty doesn't really need to have ecumenical councils. So they would say that the visible church doesn't have to have like a machine system where bishops get together and make official pronouncements, but that the epistemology sort of influx, we all just know intuitively because the Spirit is in us. So we just know that Rome is wrong and on all of her doctrines, different epistemology. So it's very hard to say, because you can have an Orthodox in the room who says things like David Bentley Hart, and then you can have an abbot of a Russian Orthodox church outside of Russia monastery challenge him, and they really wouldn't have a criteria through which to show which one had a better representation of orthodoxy, But I'm certainly more interested in the way that David Bentley Hart goes about it.
All right, so we have about 9 minutes left. So I'm wondering, Tyler, did you have any thoughts on what Erick said about Eastern Orthodox epistemology, or even Erick, if you want to talk about that a little bit, maybe some questions that you have to get some clarification on epistemology.
This is his specialty. I have no specialty in epistemology, but when I in my studies of orthodoxy, one prolific figure is Alexei Khomyakov, who was a Slavophil Russian Orthodox theologian, you could say. And his idea was, he criticized Rome because of its epistemological idea that you have to have this big boss who comes, one big boss to come in and sort of just throw the papers down, and this is the bottom line, and that's what it's going to be. That seems to serve an epistemological need for Westerners, he would say, because for Westerners, they don't think they can know anything individually. They think they have to, they have to have this singular voice in order to destroy all the opposing voices. And if they don't have that machinery of a singular voice, then we're just in absolute obscurity and we know nothing. Whereas Alexei Khomyakov would say the Orthodox Church believes that the Holy Spirit indwells and fills all things. And so the patriarch, the hierarch, the newly baptized, the Holy Spirit takes up the whole space of the church. And so there's not really a hierarchical dimension to epistemological superiority, because the Holy Spirit is giving knowledge in the whole space. So Khomyakov is one of those guys who would say that we don't need a council, we don't need patriarchs to tell us what the truth is. We have the Holy Spirit, and we just know. What would you say about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's epistemically possible, right? That that's the case. So like, who is it? Michael Kruger, I think, Reformed theologian, has a book on the Canon Revisited, or something like that, where he makes arguments that we can just know the canon, the church can know the canon just merely by this Spirit's guidance, and kind of applies Plantinga's epistemology, right, to that. I mean, I think it's epistemically possible, but I mean, there is a question about whether or not pragmatically that's beneficial, right? That sort of approach is helpful. There's also a question about whether we think that God would set up the world in such a way where there wouldn't be more of this objectivity in play. And so I am a skeptical theist, so I do have, my intuitions aren't so strong here, but I do remember having a conversation with, I think I discussed this on the last podcast we did with Intellectual Conservatism, but yeah, with Richard Swinburne, we were having dinner one night, and he was talking about how there was an attempt to have an ecumenical council, or at least some thought there was an attempt to have an ecumenical council, a few years ago. And it didn't really turn out that way, where you had some people thinking it was an ecumenical council, others not, some other people thinking it was in between, some people thinking it was like completely irrelevant, right? And yeah, and so he basically talked about how hard that sort of thing was. And I think my response was something like, too bad. It's not like you had one particular figure who could kind of rule on this, right? And everyone at the table laughs because we all know the implication of that sort of thing. And Swinburne has a particular argument from complementarianism, basically, that are for complementarianism, that man and woman are obviously absolutely equal, but nonetheless, God grants the man sort of special authority in the relationship to not basically create schism between the man and the woman, and between the husband and wife. And so in a similar way, I'm like, well, if you think that's a good argument, then why not think that that's also applies equally well to say bishops, where there is dispute. There's going to be one bishop who has sort of special power in case there's a deadlock, so to speak. And so, yeah, that seems right to me. If you think one is good, then you should think the other is as well. So I don't know. Those are my initial quick thoughts on the sort of epistemology you've articulated.
Excellent.
All right. Are there any other questions on the table, or because I have a few of my own, excuse me, to ask,
Go ahead.
Eric. Well, okay. So, I saw a paper a while back that said basically like a primacy of honor, which is what usually the Orthodox will say about the position of the Bishop of Rome, right? They usually try to say like, they try to imply that a primacy of honor isn't it's a big deal, but it's like not a huge deal, right? Let's say something like that. But then I think I saw a paper that said like in the early sources, when they used the term primacy of honor, right, it did have some jurisdictional weight to it. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're referring to Father Brian Dolly's article on presbia, that's the Greek term privileges of honor. That's an article. It's in some volumes. I have it in a couple of volumes. But yeah, Father Dolly did excellent work. He basically said that just the term itself, privileges of honor, when it when it's referring to Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, these churches had privileges in the nearby regions. Those privileges were not, hey, I know a lot, so check me out. It was they had canonical rights that they could call people to account for. Obviously, it's not what later would be called universal, immediate, ordinary, direct jurisdiction. But it certainly was not just, I have a lot of influence here, so, check me out, or else we're going to have, there certainly were privileges, canonical privileges, and these were effective. And if you didn't abide by them, they could take it up a notch, and discipline if you didn't obey the archbishop or the metropolitan. So yeah, just the term itself does signify primacy of jurisdiction of some sort, even if it's a crumb of jurisdiction. It's jurisdiction nonetheless.
Right. And then with my last minute, I just want to quickly ask, some people raise the argument that, the fact that the Orthodox have existed so long without a supreme pontiff, right, is evidence that you don't need a supreme pontiff to keep the church unified. What would you say in response to that?
Well, I would say, what does unified mean? Because the Orthodox have certainly, read their historians. They lament many divisions going from the 11th century forward. There's nothing long lasting because, several things allowed for reintegrations. You had the Ottoman Empire that came to assist in certain the governing of the Patriarch of Constantinople. Certainly you had the Russian powers that grew. You had divisions within the Russian church. You had, the Russian Orthodox Church abroad that broke away in the early 20th century. And that schism was healed, I think, like 5 decades later in 2007, just recently. You have a division right now between Antioch and Jerusalem over the issue of jurisdiction in Qatar. It's not making headline news because a lot of the characters are not English speakers, and it doesn't garner a lot of interest for Americans. But that is certainly a division in cult between Antioch and Jerusalem. And then you have the enormous break that happened in 2018, I want to say 2018 now, with the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, which Russians cannot receive communion in churches under Constantinople. So if you're a part of the Russian church, you can't receive communion in any of the Greek churches in America. And if you're, so what does unified mean? So what the Orthodox Church has done is, and with not without some good reason, but what the Orthodox Church has done is they sort of toned down the significance of visible fragmentation. So visible fragmentation is no longer and injurious to the unicity of the church. So they say, oh, we still one church. We just have these like half schisms that are happening, but they all heal up over time. So, well, I mean, if your margins are that wide on what it means to be unified, then sure, maybe you could have one church like that for a number of centuries. But just because you could be one doesn't necessarily mean that the papacy is wrong, because the apologetic for the papacy is not simply in how successful it can be, right? The primary apologetic for the papacy is that the architect put it in the blueprints. Christ put it into the blueprints of the church. That's why we believe the papacy, not because it's going to be always successful. Like Christopher was mentioning before, the popes, that they have the Avignon, the Pisan line, the Roman line of popes in the 13th century, 14th century. That certainly was confusing. We didn't know exactly who the legitimate pope was. But nobody said, oh, this papacy doctrine must be false because now we're in an epistemological paralysis here. We don't really know. No, they didn't think that. They thought this was a threat to the church, but not a fatality. And it can't be a fatality because it's divinely revealed that the papal office, the Petrine office. So, and that's how I would respond to that initially.
Well, let me thank you so much for coming out to the show. Eric and Tyler, thank you once again. And Christopher, who wasn't able to join us into the end, at the very end, thank you, Christopher, for coming on. And with that, gentlemen, I just want to thank you. God bless all of you. And thank you for coming on to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.